This episode is sponsored by Archaeologist Tours. Want to dig deeper into Mexico's indigenous past and present? Allow Archaeologist Tours to customize your Yucatan adventure. Archaeologist works hand in hand with local indigenous guides to provide a tour that is entertaining, educational, and beneficial to the local community. For an adventure like no other, check out arkeogato.com. That's ARKEOGATO.com. Or just follow the link in the show notes. Now, on with the show. This episode is sponsored by Archaeologist Tours. Want to dig deeper into Mexico's indigenous past and present? Allow Archaeologist Tours to customize your Yucatan adventure. Archaeologist works hand in hand with local indigenous guides to provide a tour that is entertaining, educational, and beneficial to the local community. For an adventure like no other, check out arkeogato.com. That's ARKEOGATO.com. Or just follow the link in the show notes. Now, on with the show.
You must excuse me. I've grown quite weary.
This hasn't been easy, I know. But you've learned a lesson. A lesson in honesty. Honesty to yourself and honesty to others. That lesson will stand you in good stead all your life.
I think we've all learned a good lesson. I've always heard that honesty is the best policy. Now I'm catching on to why that's so,
Greetings, dear listeners, and welcome to yet another episode of Tales from Atlantis, the show where we explore Chicano, Mexicano, and Mesoamerican archaeology, history, and culture, and we also combat the spread of disinformation about those very topics. We are your hosts, Kurly Tlapoyawa.
And Ruben Ariano Tlacatecat.
What is up, Dr. Tlack?
Oh, man. If I had $1 for every time someone asked me, what is Chicano Heritage Month? I think I'd be a millionaire by now. Have you been getting any questions about what Chicano Heritage Month is?
Quite a bit, yeah. People are asking me, like, is that like an official thing? And I'm like, yeah, we made it an official thing. Like,
right.
Whose permission do you need?
We don't need anyone else's permission. We, as Chicanos, we declared it, and so it is.
Yeah, that's part of self-determination, baby.
Exactly.
And anybody familiar with Chicano history should know that we've never needed permission from anyone to do anything.
Exactly.
Ever.
Exactly. So, I want to give a shout out to one of our listeners who reached out to me recently on Facebook that they're doing Chicano things up in Oregon. So shout out, you know who you are. Apparently they've been doing a celebration for about 50 years in some part of Oregon, celebrating the migrant farm workers and the end of the harvest season, and they call it Festival Mexicano or something to that effect. And so he's like, yeah, that's the way we're celebrating Chicano History Month up here. I'm like, so shout out to that part of the states. And if any other Chicano festivals are going on that we aren't aware of, please reach out to us, and we'll make sure to give you a shout out and give you a nod in that direction so we can acknowledge what you are doing in the different parts of these good old US of A states.
Yeah, it'd be cool if next year when August rolls around, we collect dates and information for any and all events happening across the country, and we just promote it.
Have like a calendar of events type situation, right? Yeah.
Hell yeah.
Sounds good.
And then after that, a paid holiday.
Right. A whole month. Go on vacation like they do up in Europe. Speaking of Europe.
Yeah, speaking of Europe. Nice segue. Our guest today is coming at us straight from Europe. We are, is it Pharaoh or Pharao? I've always wondered.
That's a good one.
In Danish, it's Pharao, but I wouldn't
Do you
require anyone to give it the German pronunciation. That could seriously hurt your throat if you try it.
Well, we are joined today by our friend and colleague, Dr. Magnus Pharao Hansen. He has a new book. Yeah, Magnus Pharao Hansen. I'm going to start calling you that.
Right.
You should put that on your business card in quotation marks. Magnus Pharao.
Far out. Yeah, there you go.
Dr. Hansen has a new book now out called Nahuatl Nations. And does it have a subtitle? Does it have a...
It does.
What might that be? Nahuatl Nations. Oh, language revitalization and
semiotic sovereignty in Indigenous Mexico.
Hell yeah. That's a mouthful.
Yeah,
but
we like having those.
Right. I mean, academics, you have to have a long ass name, right? I mean, otherwise, what are you doing?
Yeah, right. If you're not you got to put that big brain to good use there, Magnus. But that's a great name, Nahuatl Nations. That's a very cool title. And congratulations on the book, man.
Yeah, congratulations.
Thank you very much.
That is definitely a feat to be able to go from dissertation, because this is based on your dissertation, right?
Yeah.
So it's quite an accomplishment to be able to go from dissertation to book.
Yeah, it was. I actually thought I wasn't going to make it, but then COVID came, and I was just stuck in a.
Hey, lucky you!
in a room for a while, and I had to do something.
Had some time on your hands. Well, COVID screwed up a trip that I was going to take with you to Mexico, man. I was very bummed out by that.
It's screwed it all up that entire year.
So for listeners who don't know you and don't know your work, can you give us a little bit of background on the life of young Magnus there?
Well, so I'm from Denmark, so there's not really anything very natural in ending up studying Native American languages in Mexico or elsewhere. But that was sort of how it went, from me just having, when I was a kid, an interest in languages in general, and then I wanted to study languages that were different from the ones they were teaching in school. So in Denmark, we study English and German and Latin and Spanish. I did in high school.
Are most people in Denmark multilingual?
To one degree or other, yeah. Yeah. Most people have very functional English, at least, and many people also have good German. But I wanted to study something that was way different from any of that, and then I was into. So you may have heard about like this in Germany. There's this thing called where they play Indians. They do that. So they dress up and
I've seen that.
And when I was like 12 or 13 years old, I was doing that a lot myself, and I didn't, of course, like have any frame of reference of doing it. I thought it was cool, and I wanted to understand what that meant to be. I was reading like Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee and all those things, and sort of being very sympathetic to a way of life that I thought I understood something about, but wanted to know more about. So in that way, it was a little bit of that combination of the interest in languages and then the interest in indigenous cultures of the Americas that sort of made me take that interest. And then I started in university when I was 18, and I entered a program. So it's not like in the States where you sort of can do different courses, like you enter into a program and that's what you do. And I did Native American languages and cultures. And at that point, what we were studying mostly in that department was Nahuatl, because one of the big Nahuatl linguists, Una Sanger, was a professor at that point at the University of Copenhagen, and she made me take this interest in Nahuatl. Basically, it was in a little bit forced on me because I thought I was going to be studying North American indigenous languages, or north of Mexico anyways. But we had 3 years of Nahuatl requirement. So I took 3 years of intensive Nahuatl with Una Sanger and some other teachers. And then having done that, I really liked the language, and I really liked I felt I was getting better at it, of course. But then I also felt I wanted to study the language in its living setting, because we were, of course, only studying written texts from the 16th century. So what people call classical Nahuatl is what we studied. But I really always wanted to have like the experience of hearing it and of trying to speak it and of engaging and interacting and learning from the people who spoke the language that I was going to learn. So I asked her, my teacher, Una Sanger, if she could recommend some place in Mexico that she would want me suggest that I go if I wanted to learn how to really know the language as a spoken living language. And I know she's done a lot of field work all over Mexico. She has a house in an indigenous community in Guerrero, a Nahua-speaking community. She's worked in Durango. She's worked in Puebla. But she said, no, you should go to Morelos. There's a town there called Hueyapan, and this is where you should go, because that's a Nahuatl that's pretty similar to what we've been studying here. And then she wrote me a letter of introduction in Spanish, and I brought that letter and I went to Hueyapan and showed them, this is me. This is me. Please. This is Una Sanger. You've never heard of her.
Yeah.
But
how old were you at this time?
I was like 22, I think.
Okay, so you were just a little kid.
I was a youngster. Yeah. And I showed up and they received me super well, and it became in many ways this a second home of mine, also because I ended up after some years returning. I met my wife there, and now I have family in Hueyapan, Morelos. And that's where I did most of my initial Nahuatl learning as a living language. And it's also described those experiences in one of the chapters in the book.
Mm-hmm. So Hueyapan, my first exposure to Hueyapan was in the book. I can't remember who wrote it. The Being Indian.
Judith Friedlander, Being Indian in Hueyapan.
Friedlander, yes. That's right.
Yeah.
And a part of that book that really, stuck out to me was how, and it's somebody we've spoken about on this podcast before, but Juan Luna Cárdenas used to go to Hueyapan, correct? And in what sort of capacity was he going to Hueyapan?
That's a wild story. It really is a very wild story. I also came to Hueyapan prepared by having read that book, of course, and some other texts that has been published in that variety, and I tried to do my homework in that way, but I wasn't prepared for that story about what that movement meant. Mm-hmm. So Judith Friedlander sort of describes how in the 50s and 40s, when this Mexican nationalism was at its height in Mexico City and in the political establishment, and they also were very much trying to integrate this indigenismo in the national politics in different ways. A group of people came to Hueyapan, or actually I think probably first some people from Hueyapan went to Mexico City to one of the meetings of the Movimiento de la Restauración de Anáhuac, Confederado, whatever.
The MCRCA.
Right? You mentioned it almost every show, this movement, right? Because it's been
Movimiento Confederado Restaurador de la Cultura de Anáhuac.
Exactly, yeah, that one. So they went to one of those meetings, and they met Juan Luna Cárdenas, and he came to Hueyapan because he thought it would be a very good idea to teach the Nahua people there about Aztec culture and how they were supposed to be. So he created a little bit of a movement or a circle of people, young people mostly in Hueyapan in the 40s and 50s, who were studying his ideas about what being Azteca is supposed to be like. So he used that word, of course, a lot. And if you read his materials, that's sort of that's also, if you read other writers, even indigenous writers from that period, that is often how they would identify as Aztecas, right?
Yeah.
Because that was a part of the nationalist language. And they did this little movement, and he was sort of so you guys say what capacity, but that capacity turned out over time, at least it may have been different in different parts of the process of how this group developed, but towards the end he was almost in the capacity of a cult leader and sort of semi-god.
Damn.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Wild.
So he married also a woman, or more likely a little girl.
Yeah, I was going to say very, very young, right?
Yeah, she was like, what, 14, 15, maybe, if that.
And there was, this is on the level of rumor, right? But what I was told by the people that I lived with who had been there and had been part of that is that basically what they were saying, when she got pregnant, that child would be the second coming of Huitzilopochtli.
Something to that effect, right?
Yeah.
Because isn't the story, I talk about this in my dissertation.
Well, he actually was named Huitzilopochtli.
Huitzilopochtli, right.
The child was called Huitzilopochtli. He was a mechanic in Huayapan, and he was a huge man. Everybody I've talked to tells him about, are talking about how big and strong he was. And the person who told me most about it said his face was like a stone mask carved like a stone mask. So this is what I've been told about Huitzil. They just call him Huitzil. And he was a rodeo bull rider.
Damn.
In the town, and he was like.
So the name was apropos.
Yeah, he was. He lived that identity and died young. But he was basically one of the results there. But then that happened sort of when he was born, the group sort of fell apart. But when I came to Huayapan, there were still some people there who had been part of that group and who really spoke so much about Juan Luna Cárdenas, and he was the wisest person who ever knew. He was the one who had ever known the most about Nahuatl and the truth about that. And so there were people still believing in that system, and many of them had taken names of Mexica Tlatoanis and had still these ideas that what the people around them, the kind of Nahuatl they spoke, that was wrong. Like they were all doing it wrong. They shouldn't even be doing it if they couldn't be speaking Nahuatl right. And the right Nahuatl is the Nahuatl that Juan Luna Cárdenas had showed them in the books. And that was very fascinating, right? That you could be in the midst of a community where people speak that language and still think that it's wrong, like it's the wrong way we're doing it, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's something that you touch on in the book, right? So
it is. Yeah.
Getting into this whole idea, because you'd mentioned Mexican nationalism, and there's this idea of what constitutes a nation, right? And you get into that in your book, but there's this idea of Nahuatl purism, you call it, and because I'd even been told that when I was in Mexico, and somebody asked me what I was doing. I was like, "Oh yeah, I'm going to Cuentepec, and I'm trying to learn Nahuatl." And they're like, "Oh well, they don't speak real Nahuatl in Cuentepec. You need to go to Guerrero to learn real Nahuatl." And it was just odd to me to hear a Nahuatl speaker say that about another community, and like, no, don't go there. Come to us because we speak the real stuff. And I guess a lot of it comes from the level of loan words and mixture with the Spanish language, but that can't be helped, really, right? Nobody's speaking a quote unquote pure form of Nahuatl.
We'll be back after a quick break.
This episode of Tales from Aztlantis is brought to you by Aztlantis Premium. Don't you just hate having your favorite podcast interrupted by ads like this? Well, dear listener, you're in luck. Because starting at just $3 a month, you can support independent Chicano media and receive ad-free episodes, premium episodes, bonus content, and access to our Discord server. Just visit talesfromatlantis.com and click Go Premium, or follow the link in the show notes. And now, on with the show.
So I think that there's several things in it that I also try to sort of unpack in the book. That some of it is this idea that if you mix it with Spanish, it's less pure. But another part is also the nationalist ideology of Nahuatl as a language of the Mexican nation, exemplified by the classical variety that they teach at the universities and all those. But then there's also this other way that, and I don't know which of them it was that you met when they told you not to go to Cuentepec, because it could have been the other, which is that every town also has some purists who are local purists, and they'll say, we have the right Nahuatl here. So don't go over there because they're speaking it wrong, right? So it might have been someone who knew the Guerrero variety and considered it better than the one in Cuentepec. But of course, if you go to Cuentepec, they're likely to say that theirs is the right one and that they're speaking it wrong in Guerrero, unless they have these ideas that come mostly from scholarship of different sorts, that the real, also from school and education, that the real Nahuatl is the written Nahuatl. And the earlier written Nahuatl is always, of course, purer and better and more official than whatever is being written now, right? So there's all these ideas about what is the right way to do it, and they're all the time they're in conflict. So that's one of the premises of the book, that there's these different forces or movements or groups trying to strengthen the language. But they often have different ideas about what language it is that they want to strengthen and how. And that can be very cause conflicts, just questions about how to write Nahuatl, whether to use K and W or whether to use the colonial stylography and stuff like that. And it can be very conflictive. And of course, in the end, it means that some people are going to say, no, I can't start speaking this language or teach this language. I don't know what's the right stuff. Like, I'll just stay out of this and just speak Spanish. And I think that is the risk that I'm really trying to sort of point to in the book, that it's much better for the language to just let it flow, let it be where it lives, right?
So your background is in linguistics, right?
Yes, it is.
That's the approach that you're bringing to the book, to the study. And I'm thinking, isn't there, I'm not sure what it's called, I'm not a linguist, but isn't there, because this sounds very similar to, for instance, the way that people from back east refer to people who talk and speak English in the South or in Texas.
Definitely.
They're always saying, oh, they speak it incorrectly, or they have a really hick way of pronouncing words in the South or in Texas or out west or what have you.
Chicano English or African American.
It's the same thing. I'm hearing that's kind of what's happening here. I think that maybe it's sometimes we tend to overthink things that are just as simple as people having variations and thinking that their form of speaking the language is better than the people from the next town over, right? Like, it's just as simple as that sometimes.
It is that simple, but there's couple of things that make it less simple in the Nahuatl case. And one case is, of course, that for English, there's a very, very standardized language that you have to learn to engage in education, that if you want to have a teacher grade your paper and make it, you have to write it in a certain way, right? But in Nahuatl, there's no single standard that can be put as the sort of neutral standard, right? And any attempt at putting one there is going to have political implications, because it also means that whichever groups of Nahuatl speakers have something that is closer to that standard is going to have somehow more power or have an easier time acquiring that standard and so on. and then the other ones will be stigmatized. And of course, that's also the case for English, right? So lots of speakers of English in the United States and in the UK speak varieties at home of English that if they would know that if they wanted to be like a lawyer or a politician, they would have to change their way of speaking and acquire a different.
Well, I don't know about that. That seems to be out the window nowadays.
Some places at least, right? Yeah, it's certainly shifting a lot, and I hope it's going to shift also in terms of how now it can be more of a language that has a more diverse standard, right? So that all the speakers of Nahuatl can see themselves as having not the wrong kind of Nahuatl.
So I guess what I'm hearing from you is that aside from the fact that there is such a thing as classical Nahuatl that is taught in the universities and colleges and such, right? Besides that, there isn't a standard method of teaching contemporary Nahuatl because every community has their own version of it, and no one can agree as to which standard should be the one that's taught across the board, right?
That's one thing, right? And then the next step is that there's also the argument that I'm really making is that the only way to make Nahuatl important enough to keep passing it on is by using exactly the kind of Nahuatl that one's community is actually speaking.
Well, I guess that leads me to my question is that because in Mexico you hear a lot of people show disdain toward indigenous languages by calling them dialects, right? So in this case, we do know that these are variations, meaning they're dialects of Nahuatl. If they're all if every town or every community has their own dialect of Nahuatl, how do we approach something as close to a standardized language that these all dialects are a variation of? Or is it going to be the case that it's always going to be a variation, hence dialect in perpetuity, because each town wants to keep doing it their own way?
We'll be back after a quick break.
This episode of Tales from Astlantis is brought to you by Astlantis Premium. Don't you just hate having your favorite podcast interrupted by ads like this? Well, dear listener, you're in luck. Because starting at just $3 a month, you can support independent Chicano media and receive ad-free episodes, premium episodes, bonus content, and access to our Discord server. Just visit talesfromastlantis.com and click Go Premium, or follow the link in the show notes. And now, on with the show.
We'll be back after a quick break.
Have you picked up your Mexica calendar for the year 12 Flint? Or how about a paperback copy of The Four Disagreements? Just visit talesfromastlantis.com for all the latest merchandise and show some love for your favorite podcast. That's talesfromastlantis.com for all the latest merchandise. Now, back to the show.
So I think so. First of all, I think that from a linguistic point of view, there is no non-political way of distinguishing between what is a language and a dialect. It is entirely the question of what is the political community that chooses something as their standard language. That's a language, right? And if it's something else, but it's similar, then it's a dialect of whatever we've chosen as a political community as our language. So it's I'm from Denmark, and we have a very special situation, and which is very good for illustrating this principle, is that in Sweden, they speak essentially a dialect of Danish. In Norway,
Sweden.
They also speak a dialect of Danish. Except that if you go to Norway, they will say that Denmark and Sweden speak a dialect of Norwegian,
Right.
and in Sweden they'll say, or at least that's what they would say if we didn't have three separate governments and three separate nation states.
Yeah, right.
So that's basically, it's when the nation states are formed, that's when those three dialects become three languages, actually the Norwegians have two standard languages. The Swedes have one, and we have one, right? So in Denmark, we also have dialects of Danish, but any of those, if it had been the one spoken in the capital, would have become the standard Danish language. So it's a political decision and a political process of forming a nation that turns a dialect into a language.
And with indigenous communities, it seems like what you get are sort of like mini nationalisms.
Exactly.
That's been my observation, especially here in New Mexico, where we have 19 pueblos and the Navajo Nation and the Apaches. You see a lot of this inner conflict, and like that's the only way I could describe it, is like a mini nationalism that exists.
But this
They
is
call these patrias chicas in Mexico, right? Las patrias chicas, the mini nations.
Yes. And that is exactly why the nation, from the dissertation title, it was just Nahuatl Nation. And then luckily I realized it has to be a plural, because that is what the entire argument of the book is, that every town that decides that our language is our language,
right,
we want to protect our language, is a nation and has their own national language, right? So that's why I don't speak about Nahuatl. I do speak about Nahuatl dialectology, which is sort of the study of how it varies. But I don't speak about dialects of Nahuatl anymore. I speak about Nahuatl languages. So to me, I think that is the political action is to give the language. Well, I'm not giving anything, but I'm conceptually realizing that it belongs to a political community, and that the political community is who decides what is the right language for them. And then my job as a linguist is only to help them describe it if they want me to do that, help them produce materials, help them in any way that they ask me to.
Well, one of my favorite stories in the book is, and I remember when this happened, is you're discussing how the Mexican government tries to kind of co-opt the Nahuatl language as sort of like the national language that represents Indigenous Mexico, right? And at the time, there was but it's all performative, because they don't bother to actually learn how to speak any variant of the language, much less classical Nahuatl or contemporary Nahuatl. And I believe it was a candidate for the presidency went into a community and he was trying to say Tlasokamati Miak, and instead he said Tlaxcali Miak.
Yeah, that was
which is
former
like
President Enrique Peña Nieto when he was
many tortillas.
Yeah,
this kind of leads me to a question. I don't know if you have the answer for this, Magnus, but like for instance, before the arrival of the Spanish, and we know that the Triple Alliance was kind of like the head of state of the nation of, if we want to call it the Confederación de Nahuatl, whatever you want to call it, the Aztec Empire. I know that they didn't really impose their religious views on everyone, because they felt like people should be allowed to, I guess, continue to worship the way they wanted to. But in terms of the language, the lingua franca of the Confederación or the Aztec Empire, do we know if it was the Nahuatl that was spoken in quote unquote La Capital in Tenochtitlan that was used across the board and was imposed over those other variations from Nahuatl out in the countryside, or
So I think that we don't know, but what I think, and what some other scholars think, particularly the linguist Karen Dakin has written about this, is that probably what are now considered the dialect area of the periphery, so what is spoken on the West Pacific coast and all the way down in southern Veracruz and into Tabasco, might very well have been remnants of lingua franca Nahuatl. Okay. And there's some documents, early documents, that have this kind of Nahuatl that is, in some ways, you could say that it's simplified a little bit. So it doesn't have the tl sound. It has some phonological traits that are simplified. It introduces some new grammatical forms instead of the ones that are difficult in colonial or in the Mexican, central Mexican Nahuatl. So I think that probably there was a lingua franca that was a Nahuatl language prior, or perhaps even to the the emergence of the Mexica-led Triple Alliance, but it would have been probably a variety that was more like the peripheral varieties. And then, of course, with the arrival of the Spaniards, then we know how the conquest moves from central Mexico to the north, to the south, with Spaniards, with auxiliary troops who spoke the central Mexican variety. And then we can see that also is brought, for example, to Guatemala, to El Salvador, and very likely also all the way up north, right?
So the periphery now what would be the kind of the equivalent of what Esperanto was supposed to be, in a sense?
We'll be back after a quick break.
Have you picked up your Mexica calendar for the year 12 Flint? Or how about a paperback copy of The Four Disagreements? Just visit talesfromastlantis.com for all the latest merchandise and show some love for your favorite podcast. That's talesfromastlantis.com for all the latest merchandise. Now, back to the show.
Yeah, I think so. Actually, I kind of like the term lingua franca, because that is, of course, a language that was spoken by the Frankish Empire, and which seems to have been sort of spoken also perhaps by traders along the Pacific, not Pacific, the Mediterranean coasts in the sort of actually more or less the same period. And it was basically a kind of Latin mixed with Frankish, a Germanic language, right? And I think that's probably more or less what happened in Mesoamerica. There was this a language variety spoken by traders, maybe adopted by other communities, and then as these kinds of contact languages goes, it loses some of the things that it has in the more refined varieties and becomes sort of a second language, just so the way that English is now, maybe. That even if you arrive in Denmark and you want to buy something, you can go pretty much anywhere and ask for it in English, and they'll understand you at least, and they'll probably be able to answer you, right, in a somewhat.
And then you can demand and say, "Speak American."
Yeah.
Well, speaking of lingua franca, one thing that I thought was cool in the book that not a lot of people are probably aware of is how, and I forget who it was. Was it Philip II who made Nahuatl the official language of New Spain?
Yeah, there was a period there in the.
Yeah, it was like a 70-year period where they made Nahuatl the official language of New Spain until. And I'm pretty sure it was Philip II, and then I think Philip IV was like, "Nah, we ain't doing that anymore." But my question would be,
did the criollos also speak it? Were they also?
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask. Were the criollos speaking it, and what version of Nahuatl was it that they were trying to impose on all these other indigenous communities? Right, because that was the reasoning behind doing this was. Initially, they wanted the priests to learn the languages of the individual villages that they were converting. But then they were like, there's too many goddamn languages in this country. Just make everybody learn Nahuatl. And so like this different form of imperialism, right? And so the priests will learn Nahuatl, and they'll force all natives to learn Nahuatl in addition to whatever language that they speak. But that would make conversion easier, because then they could use Nahuatl as like the language of conversion, right? So yeah, were criollos learning it too? And what variant of Nahuatl were they imposing?
So probably the best evidence we have to answer that question is the Manual of Pedro Arenas, which is an actual phrase book, a Nahuatl phrase book. So it's a book used by people who only spoke Spanish to communicate with people who only spoke Nahuatl. And if you look at that book, it came out in 11 editions. The last one in the 19th century. So it must have been in use, and it must have been very useful for for people who were traveling in the countryside. It has little sections on how to say if you arrive in a town and you want to find a place to eat, or how
like
to,
a travel log.
It's a travel log. It's also how to talk with your servants. Many of them is like, if you want your maid to cook you this, then you say this and stuff like that. So they were doing something with the language. They were using the language in many contexts. So there's also examples like Sor Juana de la Cruz, who has some little snippets of Nahuatl in there in some of her villancicos and stuff like that. Mostly, I think, to sort of give like this sort of
like flavor to it.
Yeah, like a local
Mexican flavor, right?
To it, right? Yeah. And then you have like actual scholars working very seriously with the language, like Singüenza y Góngora and Clavijero and Faustino Chimalpopoca, who was an Nahuatl speaker, but also an intellectual working with the language as a translator, as a teacher, as a member of the Academy of Geography. So there were all kinds of different ways of engaging with the language, but there's no doubt in my mind that it was very common and very useful for the people, also Criollo people in central Mexico, to use the language when they were engaging with the indigenous classes who made up the bulk of the society still at that point.
Right.
And you note in the book how Nahuatl was even used up here in New Mexico with the phrase "aputos timikis."
Yeah, that was when you showed me that document, Kurly. Wow, that's incredible, because that one phrase it encapsulates this entire history of the language, right? And it's Nahuas who have accompanied the first Spanish colonists in New Mexico, right? They must have come there as maybe auxiliary troops, sheep herders, whatever, and they've been speaking Nahuatl, and then they've engaged with the local people there in New Mexico as well, because the person who says this is an Acoma warrior, who yells this at a Spanish soldier brandishing a Spanish sword, right? So he means what he's saying. But that an Acoma person threatens a Spaniard in Nahuatl is
that the expectation that also the Spaniard is going to understand what he's saying.
Yeah, so like that's the language you're going to use.
Yeah, because that's the lingua franca as you're talking about, right? Like,
even at that point, right?
Yeah, it's wild.
1680s.
Do we know if this is like the first instance of a native language being written in European script or Latin script in what is now the United States? Maybe.
Oh, I wouldn't think so. No. I think there are earlier ones.
There's earlier ones
from some of the chronicles, right? But it's definitely the earliest example of Nahuatl being spoken in what is now the U.S.
Yeah, it's wild. And if you go through these historical documents, because I pour through them, and I keep seeing two words pop up. They have like one word that's just a generic word for translator, and it's tequitato. And then for Nahuatl speakers specifically and Nahuatl translators, they call them Nahuatatos. But they spell it Naguatato, Nahuatato. So if you don't know what you're searching for, like if you're trying to use a contemporary or classical Nahuatl orthography, you would miss a lot of these words while you're searching the documents, because they're not going to pop up. You have to know what you're looking for.
And of course, the interesting, or what also is the case, is that, of course, most historians who've been working on early documents there have not been interested in what was going on with Nahuatl, right? They were interested in what was going on with the Spaniards, with Acoma, and the other pueblos. So they haven't been looking for those. And so I was just that phrase popping.
Well, because even still today, the dominant narrative in terms of the settlement of the Southwest by the Spanish is that it was Spanish, and with the understanding that there was, like you were saying earlier, auxiliary indigenous people who were brought in, namely Tlaxcalans, who were used to settle the space, but it's always framed as Spanish. Even the Tlaxcalan people get subsumed under the Spanish label because over time, a lot of these Tlaxcalan peoples become sort of honorary Spaniards in a sense. And they could even petition if they become prominent figures in their communities. Once they've settled a space, they can go from being Tlaxcalan to being a quote unquote Español, right?
Yeah.
So
and
Español at that time
already had like a very like a higher status
elevated,
for Nahuas because they were never conquered. They were allies of the Spaniards.
Allies, exactly.
So they also may have seen themselves already at that point as something that was quite distinct from
better than
whoever they saw themselves as the ones who were doing the colonizing.
Right. And when you're searching these documents, it's important to search for terms like lengua mexicana. And that's one thing that not a lot of people understand, because I saw this video a while back where it was such an obnoxious video where they were like, there's no such thing as a language called Mexican. And they were going off on how there's no Mexican language. And I was like, well, actually,
there used to be, for sure.
It was called. And to this day, right, there's a specific variant that still calls the language Mexicano.
Yeah, there are many where they still consider themselves Mexicanos.
Yeah. When I was in Morelos and I met some kids who were there selling like those woven bracelets, right? They were selling with your name. You could get one with your name. And they walk up and I'm eating at this restaurant. I'm out in the patio and these kids walk up and they're asking me if I wanted to buy one. And I said, Amo tikpia no toca. And they looked at me and they're like, what? And then the dad came to talk to them and they were like, él habla mexicano. Right. So that's like, that's even how they describe it. It was like, he speaks Mexican. And interestingly and sadly enough, I was kicked out of the restaurant for talking to these kids in Nahuatl. They made the kids leave. And they walked up and they were like, no hablas groserías aquí. And I was like, what? Dang. And so they made the kids leave. And so I was like, well, if they're leaving, I'm leaving, So I didn't even pay. I just got up and I spent the rest of the day hanging out with these kids and their dad and just cruising around. Where was I? It was in Cuernavaca.
Yeah.
And, so wait, Kurly, what I'm hearing is that you're one of these people that does not pay their tab at the end.
Yeah, just any excuse.
Any excuse just to run out on the bill.
This is bullshit. And I flipped over the table and left.
Shame on you, sir.
But it's a real problem because linguistic discrimination like that exists and is, of course, the major reason that in so many Nahuatl-speaking communities, the language is not being taught to kids, right? Because they know that they can face that sort of a situation if they speak the language still in the wrong places. And that is in spite of, like, I'm guessing would have been maybe a decade ago or more.
Yeah, this was like 1996, 1997.
Okay. Because one of the things that I point out is that a lot of the overt discourse about indigenous languages in Mexico has changed a lot. So that it's being appreciated to a much higher degree than it was even when I arrived in Mexico in the early 2000s, where this was also very common. People would be saying, why would you want to learn something like that? That's useless. Like, and they would say that about also their own language in the community. Right. And now they don't do that anymore. So there's something that's changed politically that makes it more appreciated, but still there's an undercurrent where the discrimination still happens, right?
Well, I'm glad you brought that up because I wanted to bring it back to like the communities like Huayapan where you were doing your studies, and also like Milpa Alta comes up in some of the early accounts of the things that the MCRCA was doing, Luna Cárdenas, those folks. And I think in your book, if I read it correctly, you're trying to make also the case that it's because of what Luna Cardenas and those guys were doing in those communities. And I think you mentioned it earlier that it's part of the decline of the usage and the continuation of the language. And I think that there is something to that, but maybe, I don't know, maybe I need to go back and reread it, but it seems like maybe there's a little overstating going on. Like there's too much credit, I think, being given to I think naturally over time, as you were just saying, people, because of shame and other outside factors, or just the fact that, indigenous languages in the communities aren't seen as a way forward and progressing, that's also, I mean, that's happening here in the U.S. as well. A lot of indigenous languages have gone extinct and are continuing to go extinct because they're not seen as something that's valuable for the advancement of the individual or the community. So while I accept the notion that these guys, the Mexicanistas that were going into the communities, were adversely affecting those communities, I think that maybe we give them too much credit for what's happening with the languages.
I think that's only one place that I would make that argument, and that's Huayapan specifically, because that happened, like where he actually went there and he was there, and there was this group of people who were actively out there telling their own people from their own community that they were speaking wrong, and creating this narrative of the way we speak here is wrong. And in many other towns, that's not the case. They still speak the language and they'll keep speaking it. And in other places, it is, as you say, mostly a question about, like, it doesn't offer any opportunities for progressing for taking my life where I want my life to go, or my children's life. So we don't use it anymore, right? So all of those processes exist. And it's only in the specific case of Huayapan where I would want to throw blame on
You're very, very specific. It's Huayapan.
Yeah.
Okay, well, got it. And in Huayapan, so Juan Luna Cardenas, I would imagine he had a pretty good grasp then of the Nahuatl language if he was able to communicate with people in this community, right? Or was he just speaking to them in Spanish?
I do think he spoke something more like his version of colonial Nahuatl, classical Nahuatl, right? Because he had studied it. Like, there's no, he worked for the government as the director of one of the linguistic offices under President Cardenas. Right. So of course he knew what he was talking about to a degree, right? But he also clearly didn't appreciate that there could be different ways of speaking the language, and
he also made up the word Ixachilan.
Well, he made up several words. Like, I have a words. I recently bought his little grammar, and it's fun. It's fun. There's some weird stuff in there. There's some odd language. There's a far out orthography system that he's the only one in the world to ever have used. So he's worth studying just for seeing, like,
Well,
besides Ixachilan, I mean, that term has now over the years been expanded and been pronounced Itzachilatlan. Like, people have
more syllables, the better.
You know what I'm saying? Like, they complicated the term to make it sound more complex and more deep than it actually was. It was just Ixachilan, which he came up with for the continents, right? For the Western Hemisphere, if I'm not mistaken. That's what it meant. But also, I mean, he also claimed, maybe you know more about this, that the Azteca invented the hamburger and they called it the pachola. Do you know anything about this?
Well, I don't have any evidence to say they didn't.
Okay, just running it by you, man.
Aztec hamburgers, kids.
Aztec hamburgers, pacholas.
So that would have been sholot meat, dog meat.
Oh man, why'd you have to go there?
Or masat, right? Maybe masat.
Probably deer meat, no? I mean, or turkey,
probably.
Turkey, because a turkey is originally from
or quail. America. I could see it being quail. There was always
quail for one hamburger, dude.
And well, they were small. They were sliders.
This dude said sholot.
Yeah, sliders.
So in Huayapan, you mentioned this organization, Chimalnahuatl, which that's a dope name for an organization. It's like the shield of the Nahuatl language, right? Metaphorically speaking, like the protector defender of the Nahuatl language. and you go into the work that they've been doing. Can you just expand on that a little bit? Can you tell us a little bit about this organization?
So that started up as a Nahuatl class taught in the town of Huayapan, as a way for youths in Nahua, in Huayapan, to fulfill a requirement of community service in order for them to get a scholarship from the state government in Morelos. And one youth in Huayapan, he had recently come back from the U.S. He had been in New York for most part of his childhood, and then he came back to Huayapan. And he sort of took the lead in finding out, because this was when the leftist government started coming in the different states. So they had a leftist governor in Morelos, Graco Ramirez, and he was giving out these becas, these scholarships to youths, so that they could study post secondary school, right? So I guess it's sort of in between college and high school, that level of schooling. But of course, many people, they need money to be able to do so, because otherwise they'll have to get a job and contribute to their family economy in some other way. So he was doing that by giving these scholarships. And then the criteria for getting it was you had to do some sort of community service. And this youth, Alex Maya, he made it, he petitioned if it could be okay to consider it community service for the young kids to participate in a Nahuatl course, so that they could study the language, and then by doing that, they would have fulfilled their community service requirement. And about 80 young people in Huayapan, and this is the point where hardly any speakers of below 30 years of age. And then all of a sudden, a bunch of youngsters around 17, 18, 19, maybe even a little bit younger, some of them, start going to classes, start learning the language, start taking an interest in learning the language. And when I arrived in Huayapan, and that would have been about 10 years before that, I was able to find just one teenager who spoke Nahuatl, who had grown up with his grandparents. So it's a big deal that 80 young teenagers decide that they want to learn the language, and that they want to spend their Saturdays in a very tiny, noisy classroom studying this. And then they are the ones who founded this Chimal Nahuatl organization. I guess it's a sort of a civic association, with the purpose of continuing that work after the stipend, the scholarship program ended. So in a way, I think that is the best outcome that could have been from a course like this, that it actually motivates young people to do something like that and take it up as something. They're still working on it. They're still carrying out activities. And when I go to Huayapan, they converse with me in Nahuatl, and they use the language.
That's amazing.
So it was a very positive thing.
So what do you think of, because you devote like a whole chapter to us wacky Chicanos that are reclaiming the Nahuatl language as a heritage language. And you mention specifically Jan Garcia and his organization. What do you think of groups like that? Because man, that guy he's as close to fluent as anybody I've met, man. He's really good.
He's so impressive. I'm mentioning some of the sort of what you might call the political tensions that sometimes arise between this nationalist approach to Nahuatl, and how that is often used in some Chicano communities as a way of connecting to a Mexican national heritage, and also at other times to a Mexican indigenous national heritage that is less state self-driven. And then in other cases, where it almost becomes it becomes a way to actually engage directly with indigenous communities in Mexico and build solidarity with indigenous organizations in Mexico. And I think that Jan is a very good example, because he participates in political meetings with Nahuatl speakers, Nahuatl communities in Mexico. And the work that he does in LA is used by Nahuatl speakers in communities in Mexico. So they can read like Frankenstein that he translated with Dorian Teposteco. They can use his comic book materials and all those things. So he's actually engaging directly with those communities and building these sort of practical relations of strengthening the language. That I sometimes, some of the other situations, that becomes a little bit more tenuous or conflictive when there are these ideas about that come from this very nationalist perspective of there's one right way of speaking the Nahuatl, and the people who come from Mexico up here, like, they're not doing it right. So basically, you can see some cases where Nahuatl speakers are again being told that they're not.
Telling people how to speak their own language.
And I think that has some of the same problems that Juan Luna Cárdenas had when he came to Huayapan in the 40s. So I'm trying to be sort of pointing out both what I think is really incredibly strong ways of building the solidarity from the bottom up between indigenous groups of different types on both sides of the river. And also some of the tensions that come from this nationalist heritage of championing Nahuatl as the language of the Mexican nation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know that Jan, in the newest version of his book, and I have it right here, he has this book, Learn Nahuatl, Language of the Aztecs and Modern Nahuas. He went all in with this, the modern, how does he refer to it? The modern Inali orthography. And in your book, you refer to, you call it the analytic orthography. Is that comparable to the modern Inali? Because I know both what you're pointing out as analytic.
So at the point when I was writing the book, the Inali hadn't decided yet, and they haven't published the final version of their choices yet, right? So that's why I don't call it that in the book, because they had not made that choice yet when I was writing.
And for our listeners who might not know what Inali stands for, what is it?
Instituto Nacional de Lenguas Indígenas, so the National Institute of Indigenous Languages, which is sort of the main government body in Mexico that is developing support for indigenous communities, the languages of indigenous communities specifically.
But in a sense, are they trying to standardize the way that Nahuatl is written? And in that sense, is that kind of in conflict of like what we were talking about earlier, the Patrias Chicas and the way that they see themselves as speaking their own languages in their own communities?
Yes, they are. And of course, there are good reasons for wanting a single orthography. There are good reasons for doing that.
Yeah.
But the problem is that when you have communities where they already have a writing tradition and they're using a different one that they like and that they're attached to, and they have already taught children and so on, they're not going to be happy when they have to change it, right? Or when somebody asks them to. And especially what nobody in Mexico likes, that the government comes and tells them what to do. Right?
Yeah.
Which is also the case in the U.S.
Understand.
Right. I was going to say that's basically everywhere.
So some people may in fact choose the other one just because the Inali says to use that one, right? People are like that.
You know, as a Chicano, I can appreciate that because we Chicanos, like we have our own Chicano English and our own Chicano Spanish, and we spell things a certain way and pronounce things a certain way that don't conform to English language standards and Spanish, or at least Mexican Spanish standards. And so we get it from both ends in terms of the criticism. And so I can appreciate what these communities are going through when they have some outside entity coming in and saying, you have to do it this way now because we have decided that it's the best way. So in one sense, I mean, I do understand what the Inali is doing. They're trying to standardize the way that it's written and taught so that there can be an agreement across the board where people can communicate effectively and not wonder what the other one is saying. But on the other hand, I also like sympathize with the communities who say, no, well, this is the way that we're doing it and you should respect that. So you have to find a balance in there somewhere. And what do you think that is?
So what I always say is that it doesn't matter how you write it. It matters that you write it. Like, so if people can read what you write in Nahuatl and it reaches your audience and they feel that that is the right way that they want to read their language, then you're doing it right? And I also always say it doesn't matter which writing system you choose. Someone will eventually tell you it's the wrong one.
Oh, believe me.
Yeah.
I've been using the K and the W since like 1998. You know,
it's so contested that
people get angry. And then when I saw the Inali version come out and they used the K and the W, I kind of felt vindicated. Like, yes. But even then, as you've pointed out once or twice, Magnus, I don't use the S. I use a Z. So even the way I write is like a mixture, like my own personal preference. I think
that's the Juan Luna Cardenas in you still.
Yeah, yeah, it really is.
So Juan Luna Cardenas had his good moments and his bad moments. That was one of his good ones.
His Z's were
on point.
Yeah.
Well, I was speaking to Victoriano Teposteco, and I gave him a copy of the calendar that we publish, and he looked at it and he noticed. He gave me some feedback on like a better way to spell some of the words, to write out some of the words, but he actually liked the Z too.
Okay.
And he asked me, why do you use the Z? And I said, well, I think it's just personal preference, but I think it looks stronger than an S. So just like as a graphic designer, when I was laying it out, I just liked the way the sharp edges of the Z just appealed to me visually, you know? And he was like, yeah, I could see that. But he had some really good feedback on the way that some of the words were being written, because a lot of times when you're using the Inali, like that strict Inali style, you lose the slight, like that H, almost that aspiration, mahquili. And he was like, you're not getting that H in the mahquili. So he was like, maybe added an H before that K, just so that sound is present. So yeah, it's just interesting, like having all these different conversations about orthographies and what should be used, because when people talk about, well, you should only, there's like these quote unquote purists who are like, no, you should just use the way that the Spanish priests were writing it. And I'm like, well, the Spanish priests were using symbols that we don't even use anymore, you know?
And none of them were very consistent, except for the Karochi. None of them were consistent in how they wrote it. So there's not one classical Nahuatl that was actually being used. The systems that are now classical Nahuatl are recent systematizations of those conventions.
Right, they've been standardized as well.
One's by Andrews, Campbell, and Kartunen is the one system that has the ages, and then there's the other system that Michel Launay uses that comes from the Jesuit tradition that marks the glottal stops with the accent marks. Right?
But it also depends on the language, the frame of mind. Like if you're an English speaker and you see an H, in a certain context, it'll sound like a hard H, and in certain contexts, it might not. And the same thing in Spanish. The H is sometimes silent in Spanish. And so you have to know the rule. So you have to have some familiarity with the language before you can even begin to understand those. Yeah. It's complicated.
But I always think of so when Shakespeare was writing, there was no such thing as standard English orthography. Like, he never had to take a spelling class. He never had to have anyone tell him, don't spell it like that. He was just doing it the way he liked, right? And imagine if half of his time had been spent on discussing with other people how he was supposed to write every word, instead of just writing, how much Shakespeare would we have? Well, probably a lot less, right? He had the freedom, the orthographic freedom to just write. And of course, today we have we have now a standard, well, a couple of different English standards, right? So I had to change some things also in the way that I had been taught to write English, because in the book, because there's British English and there's American English and all those things, right? So so that makes it a lot easier. We don't have to choose, but it's not necessary to write great literature or to read it or appreciate it to have a completely standardized orthography. Bernardino Sahagún didn't need it. Shakespeare didn't need it. Neither do we, as long as we can read and write.
Yeah. So back off, purists. Well, in the book, something that I wanted to touch on that really interested me and fascinated me is you talk about these cases of Nahua rebellions and just communities rising up. But there was this instance where a conflict broke out in Puebla starting in the 1960s, and it was all about, land and reciprocity. And the way that the story is told, it even includes Tlaloc, basically, as Tlaloc. It's a pretty amazing. Can you speak just what you have in the book? You don't have to divulge.
Maybe I can just give a little bit of context. Is that in the 70s and 80s there were actually quite a few uprisings in indigenous communities in Mexico, and in Nahuatl speaking areas also. Historically, or historians have often described these, and sociologists, as campesino rebellions or agrarian movements and stuff like that. But most of them, which is actually the case if you look at most of the agrarian movements in Mexico, I would say that may be an unwarranted generalization, but many of them were in fact both agrarian but also indigenous, like people who spoke indigenous languages. And what Taggart shows is that not only were they campesinos who spoke Nahuatl, they were also actually understanding their own movement in ways that are specific to Nahua culture. So in this case, in Huitzilan de Cerdán, it's a town where sort of after Mexican independence, these indigenous republics, Indian republics, which was the way that indigenous communities governed themselves in the colonial period, they were dismantled, which also meant that the protections against having outsiders move into the communities were often dropped. And that meant that many indigenous communities very quickly had an elite of non-indigenous outsiders come in and buy up the land and become the majority politically and in some cases also numerically. And that's what had happened in Huitzilan de Cerdán. So there was an elite, a political elite of within this system within Mexico, they often call caciquismo, so cacicasco, where you have like political leaders that lets their political leadership go sort of inherit it to their kids or their family members and form little dynasties and rule a community over several generations, to their own benefit, of course, and often to the detriment of small landowners that are often the ones that are indigenous and speak indigenous languages. But in Huitzilan, this conflict became very strong, and actually in the 70s and 80s became an armed conflict with many deaths, and it was actually very terrible, and you can see in the way that Taggart described it that it was very hard to talk about it, because how can you talk about a political conflict that may have caused deaths in your family, that may have put yourself in harm's way if you talk about the wrong people in the wrong way? And what he sort of shows is that they use these moral fables or
like an allegory.
Allegories that draw on Mesoamerican ideas about how you should behave, about consequences when you break religious or moral taboos. So if you are, one of the stories tell about a president, a municipal president, which is sort of the mayor, who breaks various moral taboos. And that can be just something like not being showing reciprocity. If someone gives you something and you don't give back, that's a bad thing. And stuff like that he was doing in different ways in the story. And then he experiences the consequences, which is, there's actually a couple of different versions of those stories. But one of them is a flood, because he basically manages to piss off a person who has the rain god as his Nahuatl, his soul representative, or what we can call those kinds of beings, right?
How would you
Tonal, I think it's actually called in that community. So on the day, if you're born on a day that's ruled by the rain god, then you can have a rain god soul, which means you're a rain god. And those are the kinds of people that he manages to piss off by breaking these reciprocity taboos. And then the town is flooded, and only the poor people who live up on the high sides of the hills are the ones that are saved, right? So there's a justice, a retribution that saves the poor people in the story, and that's a way for these Nahua people in Huitzilan to talk about these political conflicts without talking about them politically, making them into something that in some ways is actually a stronger claim, right? Or a stronger way of telling the story by making it something that is epic, divine, spiritual, moral at the same time. And I think that really shows that these agrarian conflicts, at least by some of the people who participated in them, were understood as also a kind of an ethnic or cultural clash, right? That goes back to those first conflicts from the colonial encounter.
I was going to ask you. I mean, this is reminiscent of, like, for instance, the discourses of the elders, and there's a book that came out not that long ago recently by Sebastian Purcell called The Discourses of the Elders, the Aztec Huehuetlatoli, a first English translation. And I wanted to see if you had read it and to get your opinion on this book. And because I find it interesting in some parts, and in other parts, I was curious about some of the things that he has to say, but I wanted to get your take on it, if you've read it. I
read about 20% of it. I bought it recently, and I got it I read the preface and foreword, and then I read some of the translations. And I have to say, I was prepared to hate it.
Okay.
But I didn't.
Okay.
When I was reading it, so I read some other stuff he had written, and generally I have a little bit of a problem with the more Nahua philosophy, scholarship tradition, and that some of that, like that, basically, I don't like that very much either in the preface, right? And I think he says some things that I would disagree with there. But then when I came to his translations, and I was prepared to say, "Oh, this is going to be terrible," but it was decent. It was good.
Okay.
Good. I didn't find any like aggravating things that I would have.
So you would recommend the book, despite
I think the translation part looks, to me, not having read all of it yet, but the translation looks absolutely reasonable. Okay. And this is a book that I think that there's. I'm not completely sure if it's the same version, and that's why this is called the first translation of the because there's another one by Maxwell and Hansen, which was absolutely, that's probably the meanest, nastiest, and also completely correct review of a book ever. Is the review of their translation of the other Huehuetlatoli. So I was thinking this could go bad, but it looked very okay.
Okay. Yeah, because I'm like halfway through the book myself, and And there's some things that I find interesting, like the way that, because this was obviously recorded after the Spanish invasion, right? And so they're trying to preserve some of the wisdom of the elders and how people should behave in public, right? You talked about taboos and about the systems of reciprocity in the community, and that's kind of what this is about as well. It's teaching the young people not to forget some of the ways that the Nahuatl or Mexica Azteca communities behaved in public. How to treat others, how to carry yourself in public, so that you don't give people something negative to say about you. Don't be chatty, don't be gossipy. Carry yourself with respect and dignity. All those ways of comportment, right? But then they also interject the imposed ideas of Catholicism and belief in the one God and Jesus and the Lord and all this stuff. And so I'm wondering if if some of these wisdom of the elders prior to the imposition of Christianity, were they going back to Tlaloc, might they have been more geared towards specific teteo that pertain to whatever it is that's being discussed? For instance, if it's related to rain, it would be Tlaloc. If it's related to the earth, it would be something else, right? Do you have any information on that? Any knowledge on?
It's super hard to say. I think that I think you can sort of rescue some of that from those, because all the texts that we have, for obvious reasons, are infused with Christianity to various degrees.
Yeah.
And I think that very competent historians, of which are many, are exactly doing that work of finding out what would this have been like without the Christianity? What could we probably, by looking at other sources and how they represent those moral principles, how could we propose that an original system of morality and justice and all those things would have looked?
Right.
But you can't do it in a way where you say this is the original.
It's always going to be an approximation, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's the only way you can get at it, right?
Well, another thing we have to understand is, so these Nahua informants, right? They had all been educated in the Colegio de Tlatelolco, right?
There are some other ones, but that was one of the main ones.
And so they were, my point being that they were learning Latin, like these students were learning Latin.
Greek,
and
Hebrew.
Because of that, they were engaging with a lot of literature in Latin. So they were adopting like the rhetorical styles of these Latin authors. So you also have that, right? Like, is this really how they spoke?
And they're also kids who were, in many cases, taken from their parents at like 10 years old and brought into a monastery, raised like with heavy discipline by friars who inculcated the right ways to do everything and told them that this is the true culture, this is how you should be doing it. And of course, that's also what they were writing with, right? So it's a very hard task. And you can sometimes find some texts that are seem to be a little bit freer of it, like just the way that if you look at the Florentine Codex, if you read the Nahuatl side, there's much less Christianity than in the Spanish side, which of course Sahagún knew that the censors of the Inquisition or whatever body of the church would be reading those to find out whether he was teaching Christianity correctly to them and telling them that their own stuff was bad.
I always liked that you could compare the side by side and be like, well, that's not really what that's saying. What they wrote in Nahuatl isn't exactly what it's saying in Spanish. So that's pretty cool. It was
and sometimes you have the annals and you have other types of texts where you can see that they've had a little bit more freedom to do what they had done, or that's a greater amount of input from elders who might not have been indoctrinated as much and so on.
Well, the thing that gets under my skin is when people will just outright dismiss things like the Florentine Codex and just be like, well, that's a post-conquest document, so you can't believe anything it says. And it's like, what?
Yeah, well, that's a great way of giving yourself the leeway to invent whatever you like.
Exactly. And that's what that's almost
because that's what you're left with. Like,
yeah. So I'll tell them, all right, so you don't want to read the Florentine because it's post-conquest and it can't be trusted, but you trust this guy who's telling you, whatever that Citlali means the first star or whatever, whatever nonsense they're making up. And
that's because they're elders, Kurly. I thought you knew.
But that's a good way to keep people in the dark too, is you encourage them not to read stuff like this. So they're not engaging with it in a meaningful way. And they're not coming away with some understanding of what the ancestors actually thought. And it makes it easier to control, right? You tell them, well, you can't trust that. You just trust me. I'll tell you. I'll tell you what it.
Yeah, and I think like what I like to do, and I haven't done with this book yet, is that I like to read the translations side by side and see, so what is Leon Portilla and Liborado Silva Galeana saying? What is Sebastian Purcell saying? What is Craig Hansen and Judith Maxwell saying? And how what is the actual text in the Nahuatl side, right? That lets you form your own opinion. Like it's sad, but there's still not enough Nahuatl scholarship on YouTube that we can just watch YouTube videos. We do have to do our own research in the old-fashioned way.
Shocking.
Yeah.
Well, getting back to Hueyapan, which is where you have the most lived experience, right? You mentioned that they're governed now. They're governed by a Consejo Indígena, an indigenous council.
Yes,
and that their council spokesperson is also referred to as Tlatuani.
Ooh.
And do they use like old, Nahuatl?
Siwakoat,
Yeah. Do they use other terms? Just Tlatuani?
Yeah. So what they had is that they used to have sort of as almost most municipal councils have in Mexico, is that they have the colonial Spanish cabildo structure, where you have like a
Presidente Municipal.
The Presidente Municipal before it was a gobernador, and then you have like different offices. You can have síndicos, you can have fiscales, jueces, and then you have all these different positions in the cabildo. And when they became an independent indigenous municipality, because that's what their way to becoming independent was, only because they were recognized as an indigenous community, because usually they would only allow new municipalities to be formed with many more inhabitants. So when they did that, they changed the structure. So there were two different factions in Hueyapan, one that just wanted to keep the same structure and just become a normal municipality with a presidente and a cabildo. And then another group that said, no, if we're going to be an indigenous municipality, we're also going to have an indigenous type structure of government, which means that we will have a council of elders, and then we will have a speaker. So what they have now is this council of elders and a speaker, and then they also have, of course, officials with specific tasks in the government. That sort of like, you need someone to take care of the seguridad pública or whatever, right? So they have that, and then they also have all the other little groups, or not big groups, that are the ones that take care of the bienes comunales. So that's the common property that is held by the community, and that's a different organization that has its own democratic system. The groups that take care of the water supply and all those. So they have like a much more like a very grassroots democratic system in that way, except that they do go to elections to vote for who is going to be the Tlatuani, or Presidente Municipal is what it's called from the outside, right? So they vote for that, and then they bring in the other days, the whoever was voted as the president would bring in their planilla to take up the cabildo. So they would put their own political faction in power, and they still do that. So in a certain way, it's very similar to what was there before. It's just called something else. And then there's a different way that they're using the public assemblies to make decisions in a way that's similar to how they all have always done it, but with somewhat higher stakes. Because before, when Hueyapan was a part of the municipality of Tetela, you would vote about certain things and then the government would make the decisions. But here they do have also a sort of direct democracy for many types of decisions, where they meet up at the plaza and the people who are there make the decision, right? And that's a very direct form of democracy, and also one that can, in some cases, be gamed a little bit by whoever brings the most supporters, right?
When I was reading this part of your book, it reminded me somewhat of a recent episode that we did. I don't know if you listened to it, where we talk about the Segunda Consigna de Anáhuac back in the late 80s, and how the political activists around Mexico City were organizing themselves in kind of a similar way, where they were electing their own sort of governments that were very localized to communities, to certain sections of the city, where they were going to, it was a very populist kind of way of approaching government, which they were trying to model supposedly based on their understanding of Mexica Aztec indigenous ways of political organization. And that's kind of like they were following the tradition of the Mandato de Cuauhtémoc, and now this is the second one. And I know that there's probably no connection between what's going on at that time in Mexico City and these communities, but I don't know, there's probably some connection in there somewhere.
I think the connection is that this is an old way of organizing politics in indigenous communities in Mexico that probably is very similar to how many communities governed themselves prior to colonization, in the sense that they would also have assemblies. They would also, in many cases, we know that they must have had some sort of not just like we think of these almost as little dictatorships, right? When we think of city-states with a ruler, but many of them were confederations with several factions of society working together to find out the ways if they wanted to organize. So Tlaxcala, the Tlaxcala Confederacy, of course, is an example of that. But it looks like a lot of Altepetl may in fact have been organized by different Calpulis who came together and sort of made these sort of more democratic. I didn't want to say democratic, but it's closer to it, like or populist or popular or communal decisions. Communal is actually the right word, because that is
communalism.
Communalism is exactly what
not
indigenous
to be confused with communism.
Political theorists in Mexico have been developing as the language in which to describe this indigenous form of government.
Yeah,
it's communalism, communality. And that's also why I tend to go with, instead of calling them dialects, do what the late great Mexican linguist Leopoldo Valiñas called them, which is communalects. So the language of a community, right?
Yeah, that's cool. Add that to the toolbox.
Yeah, I was very happy to add that.
One of the things that always irks me when I'm, you read a history book about the Mexican Revolution, when they refer to Zapata, they always kind of gloss over it. They'll say that, well, he was named like the head of his community council, right? And in reality, he was named Calpuleque. And to me, like, those two things mean very different things. And if you're named a Calpuleque, then that, if you talk about that, instead of just saying, well, yeah, he was council president and then he did this. But once your frame of reference shifts to Zapata was named Calpuleque, then that opens up this door to like, oh, wow. So what does that mean? And how far back does that go? Like, where they were drawing from these traditional ways of community governance during the Mexican
Revolution. They were still practicing. He was born in Anahuac at a time when most people in that area spoke Nahuatl. That was the Nahuatl community he was born into, and I think that they still had that government there, and that it's just a continuation of the colonial indigenous governance that was still active there. And precisely, I agree that it's important to have the terms, because it's not the same thing when we come and describe a community using like a Spanish Cabildo terms. if those people who are in the system are using a different set of terms themselves, because that means that they're understanding it differently. Kalpule is not just the same as a
council president or whatever.
Council president, or whatever, right? It's not, and it glosses over that entire indigenous political, social, and also linguistic infrastructure that operates in.
I see a lot of people online make the argument that there's no way that Zapata spoke Nahuatl. And I find that unlikely considering where he was born and where he grew up. And the majority of his troops, I would think that if he wasn't fluent, then he had to have had at least a working understanding of the language and had been able to communicate with people.
Well, don't we have like a record of a speech that he supposedly gave in Spanish? I mean, not Spanish. I mean, Nahuatl.
Yeah, well, there's the book, the manifestos of Zapata and Nahuatl, and then you have firsthand testimony, right, from when they went into Milpa Alta and allegedly Zapata addressed the entire community in Nahuatl.
The tradition of wanting Zapata to not be an indigenous leader and to not be a Nahuatl speaker comes from a mixture of some historical theoretical frameworks, particularly a Marxist way of reading Mexican revolutionary history, where you want to have classes of production forces opposing each other, so it becomes agrarianism. And then it's less important, or perhaps not important at all, that the campesino class were also, in many places, majority indigenous. Because what you see as the important part of the conflict is the class perspective, the class struggle. And then there's another part of Mexican historiography that wants to depict Zapata as a dandy. Prancing around in fancy clothes in Cuernavaca, and he did that on some photos that are very well known, right? With full
like a
traje de charro,
the charro,
right? But that is in itself, like, why wouldn't indigenous people do that if they had the money to dress up fancy? Of course they would. If they were like the leader of an entire, like, he at one point he had most of Morelos, parts of Puebla, parts of Oaxaca, parts of Guerrero, maybe not Oaxaca. In his actual, like, he was the leader of all that. Why would he dress up fancy? Like, of course he would.
And of course, you wouldn't see these historians make the same argument from the opposite perspective, right? Why is General such and such, not like a campesino if he's leading campesinos, right? Like, it's always a criticism towards the indigenous that they're called the dandies, or they're called the show-offs, or this and that, to try to diminish their stature, right?
It's essentially a racist argument. And then there's been some. I have another chapter out recently in which I talk about the demographic transition in Morelos away from being a majority indigenous state. And what turns out is that Womack, who is one of the historians who has written a biography of Zapata, in which he describes him as not indigenous, is based on a bad reading of the Mexican census of 1900 and of 19... I forget if it's 10 or 20, but what happens is that there's a shift in the way that they categorize speakers. So in the 1900 census, when they went out to ask people, what do you speak? What is your language? Then if the person said, I speak Mexicano, but I also speak Spanish, then they would only put down Spanish. And the census instructions tells the people who are taking the census, if they do speak Spanish, you put Spanish, and then it doesn't matter what other languages they also speak. So anyone who could speak Spanish well enough to answer the survey would be put down as a Spanish speaker. That, of course, means since most indigenous people are bilingual and speak both Spanish and the indigenous language, they would have been taken down as Spanish speakers in the 1900
Like a demographic erasure of indigenous people.
Yeah. And then, they're erased, basically, right? That's not what they're counting. They were, of course, at that point, they were interested in how many people can we talk to in Spanish. They weren't interested in finding out how many indigenous people were there. But then after the revolution, they count again. And then they count both. So they count the indigenous language and Spanish, right? So now you can, if you're bilingual, you're an indigenous language speaker in the survey after and the numbers are almost the same, which is crazy, right? And that's why Womack ends up saying, well, actually, basically nothing happened. There was like 10% indigenous people in 1900, and there are like 10% indigenous people after the revolution. So basically, it was the same. But what is the difference hidden in these numbers is that the first census is only monolingual Nahuatl speakers. In 1900, 10% of Morelos, more or less, only spoke Nahuatl, and you could not have a conversation with them in Spanish, or they would have been put down as Spanish speakers. And in that basically would probably mean that more than half of the population of Morelos in 1900 would have spoken Nahuatl.
Yeah.
Right.
And after then, it's only 10% that speak any Nahuatl at all.
Wow.
So that's a huge demographic shift, like a very large group of Nahuatl speakers that disappeared from the state. And of course, we know why they disappeared, because they killed them and they said that they were going to kill them.
Damn. Well, one of the most boneheaded arguments I've ever heard about Zapata is, well, he couldn't be indigenous. He has a big old bigote.
Mustache, yeah.
And I'm like,
you got the brocha. You got the big brocha.
Which is
could be fake.
Which is an odd comment to make. I mean, it's like, tell me you don't hang out with indigenous people.
Well, people do that even like with pre-colonial stuff. Oh, that's Quetzalcoatl is European because he has a beard.
Yeah. It's ridiculous.
That's just it. Again, it's just racism, and it's everywhere, right? People can grow beard anywhere. It's just a question of how many grow that degrees mustache.
Degrees of beardness.
Yeah, mine's all patchy. I can't. I couldn't.
It's like that meme of the Family Guy where they show the color code and but instead of the colors, it's the beard.
Yeah,
the mustache size. Yeah.
The mustache and the beard size.
So, how many people today, according to the best data, how many people speak Nahuatl as their first language? Or speak Nahuatl at all, actually.
That I haven't checked the 2020 survey. I don't have that number exact in my head, but I know that it's almost up around 2 million.
That's what I thought.
That identify as Nahuatl speakers. And that can include any degree of speaking because it's self-identified, right? And it's a very big shift from the 2000 and 2010 censuses. It's going up the number, which I think has to do in an important degree with it no longer being as stigmatized to say, yes, I do speak Nahuatl. So, for example, in Huayapan, I can see that people, when I came there in the 2000s, people said, no, I don't really speak it. I don't know. Don't ask me. Go somewhere else, right? Go over to those guys who were with Juan Luna Cárdenas because they say they're the best, right? But now people will say, yes, proudly, yes, I speak it. This is my language. And I think the same is happening many places in Mexico where people who had been taught to be ashamed of it now feel empowered to say, yes, this is my language. I'm proud of my language.
So what qualifies a person to be considered as someone who is a person who speaks now? Do they have to speak it fluently? Can they be like Chicanos and, speak it half Spanish and half Nahuatl? Or, I mean, how do they measure that?
No, they don't. It's entirely self-identified. So it does include, college students who took a language course. They're also included if they choose to identify as Nahuatl speakers in the survey.
Interesting.
But there would have to be a lot of those to take the numbers up from about just above 1 million to almost 2, right? That would be a lot of college students claiming to be Nahuatl speakers. But maybe there are some. I don't know if, yeah.
So,
and there's no way of knowing.
Yeah. In your book, you do touch on this idea of, and I don't see them as often now, but there were these memes going around that were like mock Nahuatl, you call it, just kind of racially tinged memes meant to make fun of, at least the way I took it was to make fun of indigenous people and the way that they would try to speak Spanish. And you show some of these memes on here, and it's basically taking a Spanish word and adding TL to the end of it. So it's very lazy humor, one. And it's just, I don't know, it's not funny and it's shitty. Like I just get annoyed when I see this stuff.
Yeah. I should say, luckily, those memes are not really circulating anymore. They're dead. But I do see places where Mexican youths trying to be edgy are producing them in writing on like Reddit and those kinds of places.
But that's an old Mexican tradition. I mean, growing back, even as a kid, I remember hearing people jokingly, saying things in Spanish, but adding a Nahuatl suffix to it in jest, right? Maybe as a kid, you don't really think much of it, but yeah, if you really take it out to its extreme, you can see the racial connotations that it has.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's of course it in some contexts it can be innocent to do that, and in other contexts, specifically contexts where it contributes to circulating, like those memes are very clearly like sort of made to mock, right? And they may not always be meant to do that, but at the same time they sort of index, they sort of point towards like ideas of Indian backwardness of whatever, like these old stereotypes of that like in Mexico it's associated with the word indio, for example, which is what nobody really wants to use that word anymore because it's become so derogatory and so loaded with negative stereotypes that of course that word is purely a slur in Mexico now, which it wasn't in the colonial period, for example. It was so those stereotypes are being circulated sometimes in those memes, even when they're not the present, because just by hearing the TL at the end of what some word, it brings that stereotype into mind, which is how these things work, right?
And then the people that are making these memes can't even pronounce the TL sound correctly anyway.
Yeah,
so that's
the other. Yeah. So I think that there's one of the things that I have there is that I think it's part of this cultural struggle in Mexico where words like white Texican and chairo and naco and all these kinds of words that some groups of Mexicans use to mock other groups or stigmatize or focus on social distinctions between different type of class identities. I think it plays into that, right? The idea being also, of course, like at the current political stage where you have like a leftist government that is pro indigenous rights, at least in discourse, and then you have like a classical neo-liberal conservative faction that is more about business, right? Money, business, and don't really promote cultural values unless they tie into their business interests. And those are sort of facing off by using those words against each other. So it's the chairos are associated with like the Morena party and this movement of social economical progressives, and then the idea of the white Texicans which is of course a way of saying like Mexicans who think that they're Americans, or think they're white or act white or whatever it was, that kind of a stereotype are associated. That's the slur that is being used in the other direction. So,
Well, to that I say, sir, the Chicanteca is the best teca.
the Chicanteca.
Aho, Meteot. So I just want to ask you, when somebody buys your book, which they should, what is like the main thing you want them to come away with from the book? Like, what's the central thesis of your book that you really hope makes its way through the pages?
I hope that it will give an appreciation of the way that Nahuatl is many things to many peoples and many communities. And that this is exactly what makes it valuable, that it is something specifically to someone because of what it means in their own context. So whether that is Calpulli de Danza in New Mexico, or an indigenous community in Puebla, or wherever, what makes the language important is the role that that community gives it. And that is what makes the language stay alive. As long as there are people who say, this is our language, we're going to use it, we're going to take care of it, then it'll stay alive in that community. And there's no way we can go out and tell other communities, or any community can go out and tell other communities that they should be speaking it in a certain way, or even that they should be speaking it. It's the decision that is always made communally. And that's why it's important to form communities and be part of communities and think communally when we want to work with languages that are at risk. And I think that that is something that I think many linguists are learning, many anthropologists are learning it, that we need to respect the sovereignties of indigenous communities. And that really what we should do is, as scholars, is to focus on how we can participate in that communality in a way that the community values. And then we can choose whether we want that community to be the Mexican national community and the ways that they engage with the Nahuatl language, an indigenous community somewhere, a Calpulli de Danza, or a Chicana organization. And we can choose which communities we participate in and how we engage with the language in that context. And that is what makes the language live.
Well stated.
Well said.
Yeah.
Yep.
So how would people get in touch with you online? Are you on Twitter? Are you on Instagram? Do you have a blog you would like to push?
I'm chronically online, I'd say. So yes, I'm on all of those, and I'm happy to generally answer questions and comments and receive nasty
debates.
Yeah, take the bait. I always take the bait, and I do debates, and I do whatever.
So is it your full name, Magnus Pharao Hansen, people should look for, or is it just Magnus Hansen?
You can, in most contexts, you can skip the Hansen and still find me.
Okay.
There's only one.
And if you put Magnus Hansen, you find a Star Trek character instead of me.
That sounds right.
So Magnus Pharao is my Twitter handle, and also my Facebook thing. And then, of course, I have a blog called Nahuatl Scholar that I write something on a couple of times every year. And I just put up a Nahuatl summary of the introduction chapter that because the book is in English, and I wrote the book in English because the dissertation was in English, and also because I want English speakers to read it, because they're the ones that are most likely to be able to give me a job and read me and all those things. So really, I feel, of course, that I should have also written the book in Nahuatl, but now I'm doing as a chapter by chapter summary on my blog.
Oh,
so
awesome.
Any Nahuatl speakers out there who also would like to know what the book is about, they can follow it there as a sort of serial.
Yeah.
That's
every month or so I'm going to put up a new chapter.
Nice.
That's very cool.
So one of the things that I took away from our conversation and your book is that you have all these patrias chicas in Mexico, all these Nahuatl nations. And I like the fact that you included the Chicano community in there. So we're part of the broader diaspora of the Nahuatl Nations. So thank you for including us in there.
Absolutely.
I think you definitely fit and belong.
And I wanna read you real quick my favorite quote from this whole book.
Okay.
Because it's just one sentence. My friend Kurly Tlapoyawa, for example, has told me of his dislike for speaking Spanish.
Yeah,
It's on record.
It's on record.
like you can
There
cite
you go.
that in your Wikipedia article. That's gonna be cited now.
There you go.
Well, thank you so much for
Nahuatl
joining us,
is a
man.
Hispanophobe.
Yeah. Queen's English in this house. Yeah, thank you for joining us. It's a great book. Congratulations again. I really enjoyed the book.
Man.
And everybody out there should buy it and read it and engage with it. We're going to put a link to buy the book in the show notes. So if anybody wants to grab it, you could go there.
Matigil na migikantok niwan. Tlonel melawak kense pahtle. Amono chipasan welik. Maskino chipa techpalewia.
Itoitase.
Hey,
Thank you for listening to Tales from Atlantis, a project of the Chimali Institute of Mesoamerican Arts. If you enjoy the show, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter. You can do this by visiting talesfromatlantis.com and clicking Support the Podcast. Your continued support will help keep the podcast ad-free and independent. Until next time, Timoitase. Thank you for listening to Tales from Atlantis, a project of the Chimali Institute of Mesoamerican Arts. If you enjoy the show, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter. You can do this by visiting talesfromatlantis.com and clicking Support the Podcast. Your continued support will help keep the podcast ad-free and independent. Until next time, Timoitase.